Who here is ready for war?
The Third World War is not only inevitable, but is already taking place.
What begins as a regional war could very rapidly escalate out of control.
The Ukraine war is accelerating the decline of the West.
The problem with wars is easier to start than to stop them, and it always gets out of hands.
Painful trade-offs will be unavoidable.
Iran will be our Syracuse. That will be our end.
You know, this cost of war thing is only meaningful if people can realistically grasp it. I don't know that they can. Well, people were very violently opposed to the First World War in the United States. So they understood, they probably had a better understanding then than we do now of war. And of course, the losses in the First War were horrendous. I can talk about that, and that had a huge impact. Yeah, I think if you wanted to talk about the similarities between the international system today and the major powers, it resembles in some ways the international system in 1914. Though we have to be careful because today's world is so different from that one. But nevertheless, you could make the argument that you have a similar set of circumstances, a group of major powers, none of whom really wants a major war, but seem to be willing to engage in well, at least engage in conflicts that could lead to it. I don't see anybody saying, oh, war's great, let's go do it. But effectively, that's what their political leaders are doing. So there's an enormous disconnect between the electorate and the ruling elites. And I think that's not the first time, because the ruling elites have no skin in the game, as you know, Nassim Taleb likes to say. And the elites think that they're immune or invulnerable to whatever happens, and they're wrong. You know, we're in a new era today that's different from World War I, at least insofar as we saw during the Second War, the elites could come under fire, and the governments themselves could be destroyed. That was World War II. But once again, the insularity of the United States, thanks to the oceans, we were able to avoid that sort of outcome.
Now we're on the verge of a potential global conflict.
I don't think so. I don't. No, I think there's the potential, but I don't think we will, no. Well, there's too much at stake. I mean, you have these major nuclear powers. Everyone does, the people in charge do understand what a nuclear weapon does. So we've reached the point now where the nuclear weapon can't be used. If it is, it devastates everything.
So where has warfare gone to?
Just below the nuclear threshold. And the point is that we've already seen what kind of damage can be done below the nuclear threshold. But we don't seem to think that that damage could occur here. In other words, we don't think anybody could say to us what we have done to Russia with long-range strikes into Russia through a surrogate. And we're wrong. I think because the broader population in the West, particularly in the United States, but across most of the West, is very largely disengaged from policymaking. Policymaking rests in the hands of a few people. We're learning that here at home in the United States. You have these billionaire oligarchs. You could call them tech bros, whatever you want to say. Simply people that, you know, I was reading about one the other day who's a billionaire thanks to the diamond trade. And the enormous wealth at their disposal allows them to shape policymaking. That's what we're dealing with. Policy in Washington has nothing to do with what the average American would prefer, like or dislike. So I think that's something that has to be taken into consideration. People that talk about democracy are, you know, selling us propaganda. What democracy? The people that are elected largely as a consequence of the money at their disposal. And you could point to someone like Thomas Massie from Kentucky, who has a very strong, loyal base that returns him to office because he represents their views. Well, that's wonderful. I wish we had 800 Thomas Massies. We don't. The vast majority of people run on one platform and then respond to the financial incentive that is presented to them while they're in office. And they'll argue that if they're going to stay in office, they need lots of money. And they have to take the money from the people that offer it. And they convince themselves that in most cases, the issues that are important to people really don't affect their constituents very much. Then they can go ahead and essentially prostitute themselves. Well, of course, this is wrong, because the issues can profoundly affect us. The problem with military power and conflict is that accidents and chance play too much of a role. Whatever you set out to do, whatever you think you're going to do, and what actually happens are frequently not connected. Once things are in motion, you tend to lose control. And that's the big problem. That was, of course, the outcome in World War I. Very few people believed that Russia would suddenly mobilize, which it did. And it was really Russia's mobilization under Tsar Nicholas II that precipitated the World War. If Russia had not done that, the Germans certainly would not have done anything. And they would have focused exclusively on the West, where the French were mobilizing. But the Russian mobilization changed everything. Well, the cost of war is obvious. I mean, we're flat broke here in the United States. We've hollowed out our economy. We've destroyed most of our manufacturing capability, all in the name of maintaining this artificially high standard of living. And I think people are going to get an education at some point when the financial collapse sets in, which is coming. I mean, I would say you've got maybe four major conflicts right now, maybe five. Let's look at them. One, the obvious one, is in Ukraine. This is an artificial conflict. Had we not deliberately intervened in Ukraine to establish a government in Kiev that was stridently anti-Russian and essentially slavishly devoted to the United States and NATO, there wouldn't be a conflict in Ukraine. And we've been losing the conflict ever since. The Russians held back and exercised extraordinary restraint for long periods of time until finally they said, that's it, we're going to have to intervene. And when they realized what they were up against, because I don't think they understood just how much had been invested in the Ukrainians. You had 800,000 men in the Ukrainian military, in the army at that point, half of whom were regular, the other half were reservists, but they were all well-trained, well-equipped. Well, now they're all dead. They've lost 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield, maybe more at this point. But nevertheless, we continue to stoke these fires and keep this conflict going on the assumption that if we do it long enough, Russia will collapse and will fall into our lap. And then we can move into Russia and strip it of its resources and exploit it for business purposes to enrich the minority of people in Washington that wanted the war to begin with. And now I don't see any evidence that anybody in Europe is seriously interested in saddling up and riding east into Russia. I don't think people want to do anything like that, but their governments that seem to be just as unresponsive to the populations that elected them as ours are, seem intent on provoking the Russians. And perhaps there's this thought that if the Russians are provoked, the United States will then put everything at risk and launch a major war that could, escalate to the nuclear level. I don't know. I don't know what the real thinking is behind the scenes, because my assumption is as follows. What's the first principle of war? Don't fight. Why do people risk war with Russia today in Europe? That's the real question. Why would anybody do that? And it's a combination of things, but I think at the top of the list is this incredible assumption in the minds of the elites that are ruling Europe today that Russia will not go to war, that somehow or another they can tinker on the margins of a crisis, they can play at going to war, and no one is going to call their bluff and go to war. Mm-hmm. That's hard for me to imagine, because we look at the years since February 2022, you see the buildup of military power in Russia. You see this huge scientific industrial base that is operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. You see that none of the sanctions have had the impact that was hoped for. And you realize that this is insane. You're playing with fire. Russia isn't going to fall apart. There will be no internal rebellion to remove President Putin. That's all nonsense. Yeah. Russian society is cohesive and durable. It's the West that has a society or societies that are not cohesive, that are not durable. So you would have to say that the people that are pushing this are certifiable, They all belong in Bedlam somewhere. It's a combination of ignorance, arrogance, and wishful thinking. You put the three together and you get Starmer, you get Macron, you get Merz, at least at this point, in Berlin. These people are living a fantasy world. They don't understand how close they are to a confrontation that could cost millions of lives. Well, Macron is a Sorosista, as we call him. He was picked by Soros, this little effete banker, to step forward and become the president of France. He was a nothing with almost no track record. It's sort of similar to Obama. Who is Obama? You know, he's a community organizer, comes out of nowhere, and suddenly billions of dollars are made available, and they decide to make him a speaker at the Democratic Convention, and everyone is in a state of shock. The man can make a coherent speech. He seems likable. Obviously, he's qualified to be president, so let's run him. Yeah. And he wins. It's kind of a stunning outcome, if you think about it. Well, Macron falls into the same position.
How would you characterize the Israeli conflict now with their neighbors, vis-a-vis Iran?
I think to understand the Israeli conflict, you've got to go all the way back to Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was by no stretch of the imagination a friend of the Jews. He was one of these hard-headed characters that disliked all sorts of people. This man had no college education. He was actually a fairly rough-hewn, ignorant individual. As President of the United States, when the issue of Israel and recognizing it as a legitimate state came up, he listened to several people. George Kennan, renowned diplomat, author of Mr. X, George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army. There were many others, and these were people that everybody trusted, thought highly of, especially Truman, and they all told him the same thing. Don't recognize this state. If you recognize this state, there will be war for 50, 60, 70 years because the population in the region doesn't want it. This is an artificial construct. They didn't use those words, but that's effectively what they were saying. And this, of course, was never intended to be the kind of independent state that it was about to become. But then his political advisor came in to see him, and he told President Truman, if you recognize Israel's right to exist, in other words, you make it a legitimate nation state, you will have all the Jewish money available in the United States in perpetuity for the Democratic Party. So he said, good, and recognized Israel. Well, Truman was not well educated. He didn't understand the strategic implications. And it wasn't important to him. What was important to him was money for the Democratic Party. Well, remember the same thinking that tells everyone that Russia is weak and incapable, that it effectively can be bullied. Remember the statements about Russia is the gas station with nuclear weapons and so forth and so on. These kinds of things also underpin the support for the Israelis. Well, the Arabs are weak. The Arabs are divided. The Arabs aren't capable of fielding any forces that can make any difference. So Israel is surrounded by weak neighbors that, frankly speaking, Israel can bully. And so why should we care what the Israelis do, particularly when the Israeli lobby pays handsomely for support? And why would you want to be Thomas Massie? Why would you want to be at the top of the anti-Semite list? So instead of saying, it's not a question of do you love Israel or do you love Jews, it's do you love money? The answer is yes, we love money. And so most people on the Hill are falling all over themselves to pick up cash. It's also cornered us in the world as, backing this genocidal regime. If you were looking for a point in time when the United States is more hated and trusted less than it has ever been in its history, I suspect we've hit it. It's now. There's no belief at the moment that if we continue to back Israel, or worse yet, support them in a direct assault against Iran, that Russia will intervene. People don't think that's possible. Right? Well, they assume that, Russia can't possibly do that because they're too bogged down in the war with Iran. People have never understood that Putin from day one has always exercised tremendous restraint because he does not want a war with us or NATO. We assume that we can master the situation militarily. That if Israel would have difficulty in succeeding in a war with Iran, that we could pitch in and with very little difficulty help Israel win. Now, that's very dangerous thinking, because it's very clear to anybody who is paying attention to the Russians right now and to Mr. Putin that the Russians are very, very close to the sort of boiling point. Let me put it this way. They have mastered the situation in eastern Ukraine. The question is not whether they could move into Kiev, take the city and crush the government. They can do that. The question is, do they want to do it? So when you look at Iran, and if we get involved in a war with Iran, the Russians are not going to sit quietly and say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm too busy here in Ukraine, and allow the Iranians to be pulverized out of existence. It's not going to happen. So we're going to end up at some point in confrontation militarily with Russia. That's an inevitability. If the Israelis precipitate a war with Iran, what begins as a regional war could very rapidly escalate out of control and involve other major powers that are not necessarily in the region. Very obviously, Russia will not sit by and watch Iran be pulverized. Neither will China. And all you have to do is look at the presence of Chinese vessels in the Indian Ocean, Russian vessels inside the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, submarines as well as surface vessels. And look at the presence of technicians. There are Russian technicians and military advisors on the ground in Iran. They have been working tirelessly for the last 12 months to help build up an effective integrated air defense system. The Iranians have an enormous arsenal now that allows it to strike back with great power against Israel, and for that matter, against any U.S. installations. So the point is that what seems to people in Washington as something that is limited and narrow could very quickly move just beyond the region and involve major powers around the world. And by the way, people seem to think we and our so-called European allies, in Donald Trump's words, hold all the cards. But the opposite is the case. Look at BRICS. Look at the numbers of nations in the world. Where do they come down? Nations with resources that are critical. These nations are all on the side of Russia. I would argue that you probably have between 60 and 90 nations around the world that are on the side of Russia and Iran and China. Well, the Western powers have already alienated the global South, along with most of Asia and Eurasia. This war that is developing and fomenting right now would extend that to annihilation. In other words, this could annihilate us. Now, why do I say annihilate? You don't necessarily have to come under nuclear assault. What happens to your economy? What happens to your trade? You know, what happens to your prosperity, your standard of living? All of those things could be destroyed.
Well, I'd like to also bring up the fact that every major conflict has started with sort of a false flag or rationalization.
Now you're talking about something that has been an enormous problem for years. I mean, look at the Spanish-American War. There was no real reason to fight the Spanish-American War. What we demanded of the Spaniards was largely met by them. They acceded to all of our demands. The Spaniards were at the end of empire. Their empire was dwindling quickly, and if you stood by long enough, it would fall apart on its own. It didn't need any help from us. But we decided that we wanted to intervene, and there were obviously commercial interests in Latin America and the Caribbean Basin involved with everything from plantations to copper mining to any number of other things. And there was this enthusiasm for a great little war that the American people were extremely enthusiastic about. And there were even people that talked about the fact that this would be good for reconciliation between the North and the South, that this would unite the country. And so we launched into this. Not every war is the same. Not every war is the same. And of course, what was different about the Spanish-American War is we stayed in the Philippines. We inherited this thing from the Spaniards. We're not an imperial power, and yet we stayed. Well, we tend to go to war thanks to events at sea. Now, why is that? Well, historically, it's very hard to know what actually happened at sea.
So it's a good kind of operational security.
When the battleship Maine blew up, as we know now, it had nothing to do with the Spaniards at all. They had a fire in the galley of the ship, and the fire spread. It hit the magazine and blew the ship up. It was very fortuitous for the people that were looking for a war. Remember William Randolph Hearst's famous statement to a journalist? He says, go down there and cover the war. And the journalist says, but there is no war. He said, you just go down there, I'll provide the war. You provide the coverage, the news. And sure enough, we had the battleship Maine blew because I think he assumed that some event, catalyzing event, would occur. Well, the Lusitania, the Germans bent over backwards to tell everybody not to go on the Lusitania. They said this is carrying arms and ammunition for the British who are fighting in World War I. Don't ride on this thing, it's going to be sunk. Yeah, they published it in all the newspapers and so forth. So what happens? They sink this thing, and everybody says, well, that was wrong. There were just innocent men, women, and children on. And what we found out within the last 20 years, we sent down divers, and there's all the ammunition, there are all the armaments on board the Lusitania. It didn't matter, because by that time, the decision was made in Washington that we were going to enter the war. The question was, how do we do it? How do we justify it? Lusitania was a big part of justifying the war. And then you go to Pearl Harbor. Well, the interesting part is that in June of 1941, General Marshall was told by FDR that FDR was going to embargo oil, tin, copper, rubber, a whole range of things going to Japan, that we would no longer supply these things to the Japanese, allegedly because of what they were doing in China. Of course, we had no alliance with China. Sound familiar? We had no agreements with China, and we had no real reason to do any of it because we knew that that wasn't going to stop the Japanese from doing whatever they were doing at the time in China. So in June of 41, Marshall turns to the Chief of Naval Operations and says, we need a meeting because we know, and this is important, we know that when this embargo goes through, the Japanese will be at war with us because we're cutting them off. What are the Japanese going to do? They have no choice. We're essentially choking the life out of their economy. So this is in June, and the Navy and the Army meet. Now, they reached the wrong conclusions. What was the wrong conclusion? That the Japanese would strike first at the Philippines because we were so close to it. We had a garrison in the Philippines. By the time we divined where they were going to strike, it was too late for us to do a great deal about it. Yeah. But of course, this was a welcome development. Stimson, who was Secretary of the War, in his private papers wrote, "Thank God they attacked us. If they hadn't, we would have had to attack them in 2 weeks." We were trying to get out of the Depression. Remember, FDR implements the draft in 1939 after Marshall becomes Chief of Staff. Marshall, of course, was highly regarded in Washington as an apolitical figure. So the Republicans that were controlling the House and the Senate at the time trusted him. And he went over and testified and said, yes, I think we need the draft. Why? Because of the protective mobilization plan I talked about earlier. It was seen as prudent, a prudent measure. Yeah. Not because Marshall wanted anything to do with a war with anybody. He didn't. And the interesting thing about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, of course, when it was reported, it hadn't happened. and there was only one officer in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the JCS, who called to a senator's office, and I wish I could remember the senator, which one it was, and he reported, this is a lie. Nothing like this has happened. And they said, well, thanks, and hung up the phone. And everybody universally approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the rest is history. I mean, you could call these false flags to some extent. It certainly failed to say that World War I and World War II, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, were definitely contrived. You could say that about Vietnam. That was contrived, designed to drag us in. The real cost of the Vietnam War was we went off the gold standard. We spent ourselves into oblivion in Vietnam and the war on poverty. You put the two together and something had to give. And so Nixon then responded by going off the gold standard temporarily. Like everything else in Washington that begins as a temporary expedient, it becomes a permanent feature. Now, what happened in Korea? Well, Korea was entirely different. Well, the Gulf of Tonkin wasn't real, but it was contrived. And the thing to remember about Korea is that General MacArthur had recommended complete withdrawal from the peninsula. That was in 1948 because he said we can't possibly defend it. And it's ultimately beyond our defensive perimeter. What was our defensive perimeter? It ran around Japan, down to Hawaii, and then back up to Alaska. And he said, this is beyond our perimeter. It was contrived. It was not real. It had not happened. And the people in the Navy knew it. Now, what are we at risk of right now? We're at risk of an incident at sea, in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, or the Indian Ocean. Why? Well, look at what the Houthis have managed to do. They damaged an aircraft carrier and drove an aircraft carrier battle group out of the Red Sea. And I think that was because somebody finally got to the president and said, Mr. President, I don't think we can defend against this, and I don't think we're going to be successful with long-range strikes against the Houthis. And so he said, fine, we'll tell the Houthis if they'll stop shooting at us, we'll stop shooting at them and we'll get out. And that solved our problem, right? I think that's still a great danger, that you could see the loss of a ship at sea in any of those settings, and then you're almost automatically at war. They've already worked tirelessly to convince everybody that the Houthis are obedient to the Iranians. The truth is that the Houthis were supported by the Iranians because the Saudis originally working with ISIS, which people don't seem to know, and Al-Qaeda, were trying to annihilate the Houthis in Yemen. And the Iranians initially told them, listen, don't come to us for help. Make a deal with Riyadh. And they tried, and they came back and said, we can't make a deal. They won't listen. So grudgingly, that was the beginning of Iranian assistance to the Houthis. Now, the Houthis decided, without any encouragement from the Iranians, to attack in support of their brethren in Gaza. The beginning of the wars could be easily traced back to Ambassador Gillespie in Baghdad. And she was asked point blank by Saddam Hussein, or certainly his foreign minister, if we were to intervene in Kuwait, what would be the fallout with the United States? How would they respond? And she, without consulting anybody, allegedly indicated that that would not be treated by the United States as a major event. After the war between Iran and Iraq, which Iraq fought largely at our behest, we encouraged it, we supported it, we funded it, we armed him. I know officers that I served with who went over there as advisors. So this has to be understood against the backdrop of cooperation with Saddam Hussein against Iran. So he turns around and says, well, I'm broke, and I need access to the wealth that the Kuwaitis have with the oil fields. And what he wanted to do was to control the oil fields.
Saddam.
Yes. And her answer apparently was misleading, but she seemed to convey the impression to him that this would not precipitate a major response from us. And this was all staged for Congress. So there was suddenly, major enthusiasm for going in there and fighting. I mean, we could have something at sea very easily. It could happen in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean. We don't know. It could involve U.S. naval forces that are there in some fashion. I think we have to understand that there has been some positive development in terms of American thinking. Americans no longer trust the news. Americans, I think, are increasingly suspicious of whatever the government tells them. I mean, if you look at COVID, which was devastating to us economically and strategically, perhaps the only good thing that came out of COVID is that everybody's realized now that they were lied to. And so people are no longer willing to trust whatever the government tells them, whether it comes out of the World Health Organization or the National Institute for Health, or it comes out of the Department of Defense. I think a lot of Americans are now very suspicious. That's a very good thing. The problem is that these things have a habit of happening, and then the institutional media, the mainstream media, along with everybody on the Hill, they all pile on together and say, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. And Americans may be suspicious, but I don't think they're strong enough at this point to turn around and say no. I wish they were, but I don't think they're there yet. And so they're inclined to say, okay, on the assumption That again, war is something that happens on someone else's soil. War doesn't come here, despite the fact that you've had Tulsi Gabbard and others in the intelligence system say, you know, we just allowed 30 plus million human beings into the country about whom we know nothing. And we have vast cells where it's difficult to tell who the criminal is and who the terrorist is because they overlap. And in the event of any major conflict involving the United States, it's a virtual certainty that we will be attacked internally. We have today what I would call chaos media. It's just chaotic. No one knows what to believe. What we need is authoritative media or authority media. Back in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, you had this man named Walter Cronkite. And he and Huntley Brinkley and others, they all were seen as people who were trustworthy. Americans looked at them and believed them. This is before news became entertainment. This is before we had lots of attractive blondes with short skirts sitting on sofas telling us what to think. So here were these very serious men telling you what the news was. And they generally stuck to the facts. But at some point, and I think this is after the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite said, we can't win in Vietnam. It's time to consider getting out. And Lyndon Johnson said, oh my God, we've lost Cronkite. We've lost the war. Well, he wasn't wrong. I mean, he was making a valid point. We don't have authority media. We don't have media that people trust. We have lots of entertainment and attractive women, and then we have sort of goofy characters, much like this man Hegseth, the tattooed veteran who has multiple children, multiple wives, and so forth and so on, who just loves the military and is a really great guy. This is what you've got now. We need authority media. Now, there is a potential for authority media to arise. Right now, it lies with alternative media. And what is alternative media? Well, these are all those evil right-wing nationalists, white supremacists, and conspiracy theorists. They are the incubator, if you will, for authority media, because they're really trying to get to the truth. Now, they're imperfect. You have lots of people there, good people, horrible amateurs, and some of them are just shameless sensationalists. But we have to build authority media. We have to have media platforms where people say, look, we're telling the truth, whether you like it or not. We're not here to advocate for anybody except the truth. I think the point is this, and I said this at the beginning, what's the first principle of war? Avoid it. In other words, if you're not compelled to fight, you're a fool to fight. And that's very important. Secondly, we're Americans, which means that in most cases, to fight someone else, we have to travel quite a distance, 6,000 or 7,000 miles to some place no one in the United States has ever heard of. And then we justify this on very specious grounds. We're fighting for liberal democracy and human rights. It's all crap. It always was, always will be. At least one could make the argument, as the Marine general or former commandant who made... Butler said war is a racket. All we did was advance commercial interests and so forth. Well, this may come as a surprise, but I can make a good argument for that. If you're trying to protect your commercial interests, and those interests are of importance to the American economy, I have no objections to the use of military power if you're trying to secure something. So I'm a little less upset about that than others are. But the point is that what we're doing and what we have been doing, I would say, since Vietnam is the opposite. We did have a grounds to go in 1991 and defeat Saddam Hussein. The problem was that when we did it, and again, the generals were all wrong because they anticipated disaster, when it ended as quickly as it did, as successfully as it did, we had no plan. There was no sense of end state. What do we want to do? And at that point, you had to make a decision. Well, if we're not going to replace Saddam Hussein, let's sit down with Saddam Hussein and do business with him and say, look, you can stay as the ruler of Iraq, but you've got to meet the following conditions. We're not going to tolerate action from you that we don't approve of. You can't attack Israel. You can't attack Kuwait. You can't attack Saudi Arabia. We're not going to tolerate that. If you're willing to go along with us, you can stay. But that was incomprehensible because we had already demonized Saddam Hussein. Before you go to war, you need to answer some very important questions, and the American people need to demand answers. In the past, they haven't. What's the purpose of the war? If we fight it, how are we going to fight it? And what's it going to do? What's the consequence? What are things going to look like after it's over? I mean, if you start going down the list of all the people at the top of the Trump administration, they've all prayed at the wall and signaled their readiness to do what the Israel lobby wants. Now, then you've got to ask the question, are they willing to risk war, not just with Iran, but also Russia, China, potentially Turkey? If you see anything positive in Israel, and I always have, then you would try to dissuade the Israelis from marching down this suicidal path. But that hasn't worked. And they seem hell-bent to commit suicide. And it's not just a minority. It's the majority of people there who absolutely think the mass murder of these Palestinians, not just in Gaza but on the West Bank, is justified. And that they have a right to do it. And you have these people in the United States, sadly, who think they have a right to do it. Now, some of that may be religious, and some of that may be complete disinterest or personal distaste for Muslims. You've got to remember that we've had difficult relations with the Muslim world now for over 20 years. Yeah, I think it's a distinct possibility that Israel may not survive. Iran certainly has the military power to flatten most of it. And of course, the other question is, why would you want to go to Israel under any circumstances given the hostile conditions around it? Whereas Israel is a beautiful place. It's a great place to go for a vacation. You have all sorts of interesting things to see and visit. I like the Israelis as people. I've dealt with them. I see positive things, but right now, under the circumstances, they've made themselves into a pariah state. What future is there for them in that region at this stage? You tell everyone in the region around you that you're an animal that deserves to die. Literally, that's what they've done. The current aggressive posture of Israel is not sustainable over the long term. And I think that Netanyahu and his supporters know that. And that's why there's enormous pressure to do things now, because they have control of the United States, its armed forces, its population, its government, in ways they've never had before, and it's not going to last. Well, it's obvious that if they strike, that we will feel compelled to support them. We will go in to help them. Now, how long will that last? In other words, how far will our help go? I can't evaluate that, because the nation today bears no resemblance to the nation I saw in '91. You don't have the kind of cohesive society that we still had in '91, where you could pull Americans together. Who are the Americans today? That's an important question. And I think you need to answer that before you go to war. Well, first of all, the EU is dead man walking, just as NATO is. These are fragile institutions that are really increasingly empty facades. All you have to do is go to Hungary, go to Slovakia, go to Romania, and go to Italy. What do people think of the EU? Well, they're extremely hostile to it. And you've got different reasons for people to feel that way. I mean, the funniest thing I hear all the time is, it's those Germans, the Germans are responsible for this and the EU is dominated by it. Well, okay, fine. The truth is, the European Union was transformed into this entity that was supposed to become a supranational government that would rule a united Europe. Well, that's nonsense. Europe is too diverse, too many different interests, too many divergent interests. So EU is done. It's a matter of when, not if. Same thing is true for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They've all overreached, and they're not going to survive. The Lilliputian armies of the European Union are boutique forces. They have no means of integration, cooperation, or alliance at all. None of them, taken together as one, have any chance of success against the Russians. They have no unity of command. They don't have a unified vision. They are not uniformly equipped and trained. So the notion that this conglomeration of Lilliputian forces is capable of fighting Russia is absurd. Anyone who thinks that we will ever be in a position to challenge China militarily is probably certifiably crazy. Now, why is that? Because our plans right now require us to travel 7,000 miles, ostensibly for the purpose of defending Taiwan from Chinese invasion, when Taiwan is widely recognized as part of the Chinese nation. And we can't defend it. We could stand by and watch it be destroyed, but we can't prevent it from becoming part of China if that's what China wants. The good news is that the people on Taiwan aren't interested in a war with China, and given the opportunity, they'll vote themselves into it. There are widespread discussions about that. You have two parties on that island, and one party is pro-Beijing, the other party is pro-Tokyo and Washington. The point is this: you don't fight the enemy on terms that favor the enemy. We've done that in Ukraine. That has been a catastrophe. It's destroyed the Ukrainian nation. 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers are dead. Russia is roaring into first place as the world's preeminent military power, certainly in terms of land power. Let's be rational. It's nothing to do with patriotism. It's logic, it's reason, which seldom intrude into discussions. No one in their right mind is going to challenge China to a war in this country. It's a losing proposition. China is a continental power. We are a maritime power. China has maritime and aerospace power that probably matches our own in many respects. We still have areas of supremacy. But the point is that no maritime and aerospace power can triumph over a continental power. It can't be done. And we have to fight 7,000 miles away from home, with all of the problems that that represents, in a world of precision-guided missiles. We hear stupid statements about China come out of Washington every damn day. We have fools in the Pentagon that talk about it all the time. When I was there, I sat with people that were theoretically part of the China Strategy Group, and they were fools. They were beyond stupid. They didn't seem to understand that every logistical point on the ground of any significance and importance to us would be destroyed in the opening hours of the war. They didn't seem to understand that surface fleets were just target arrays in the Pacific now. How do you fight such a war? And then they kept insisting that China was aggressive, and I said, fine. Where are the Chinese armies massing on the border with Vietnam? Where are the Chinese armies massing on the border with Korea? I said, they're not there.
So why do you think all this war drumming on China?
I think there are two reasons. I think one important reason is that if you don't come up with an enemy picture that is persuasive and convincing enough, you don't have $1 trillion defense budget. And we don't need $1 trillion defense budget to defend the United States. We're not interested in Washington in just defending the United States. We're interested in preserving what we think is our global military hegemony. But that's gone. That's the whole point. The last 30 years have changed all of that. What does global military hegemony depend upon? Depends upon economic strength and prosperity. That is being destroyed in this country. So the whole thing is a fraud. It's not doable. It's not achievable. Today, it is China that has the largest manufacturing base in the world, not the United States. So the notion of going to war with China is sheer lunacy.
But what about EU just hammering every day about all this war with Russia?
Well, these are desperate globalists that are clinging to power. If they can't persuade Europeans that they are of imminent threat, they are in a position of imminent invasion by the Russians, what keeps them in power? Well, the EU is already breaking apart. It's going to fragment. Look at the Hungarians, look at the Slovaks. The Romanians aren't very happy with it. Our friend Maloney is furious in Italy. The Spaniards don't like it. The average Frenchman wants nothing to do with it. He sees it as a Trojan horse for German domination. And then the Germans hate the EU because they see this as having come at the expense of German national power and interest, and they're not entirely wrong. Germany has been the milk cow that has been milked and slaughtered over the last 50 years to sustain, support, and enhance life in Europe for the Europeans. That's the way they look at it. So now this thing is dead. We're going to see all of these things replaced by new regional security zones where the peoples are organized around thinking and ethnicity and language. We're in a very, very bad situation. We really are, economically, and I think in profoundly human terms inside the United States. No one wants to admit it, no one wants to confront it, and no one wants to do what's required. So when you have those conditions, you know what happens. Things get worse. And they will.